The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as Charles sat alone in his private study. His mother had been gone for nearly 2 years now, and still the weight of the crown felt heavy upon his head. He stared at the documents spread across his mahogany desk, each one a reminder of the legacy Queen Elizabeth had left behind. The late Queen had been meticulous in her planning, ensuring that every possession, every property, and every piece of jewelry had been accounted for in her will. Charles had spent months working with lawyers and advisors to honor his mother's wishes. The Queen had been clear about her intentions. Certain pieces were to go to William and Catherine for safekeeping until George came of age. Anne was to receive several personal items that held sentimental value from their childhood. Even Edward and his family had been remembered with thoughtful gifts. But what troubled Charles most was the growing tension surrounding items that his mother had specifically designated for the nation and the crown. Itself, Camilla had been supportive during the mourning period, or so Charles had believed. She stood beside him at the funeral, offered comfort during the difficult first months of his reign, and seemed to understand the gravity of their new positions. But lately, something had shifted. Small comments here and there about what belonged where. Suggestions about redistributing certain items, and questions about why particular pieces couldn't be moved to different locations. It started innocuously enough. Camilla mentioned that some of the Queen's jewelry would look beautiful on her daughters. Charles had gently reminded her that most pieces were part of the crown jewels, or had been specifically bequeathed to other family members. She had smiled and nodded, but he noticed a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. Then came the suggestions about Balmoral. Perhaps some of the furnishings could be relocated. Maybe certain areas could be redesigned. Charles found himself explaining repeatedly that Balmoral held deep significance for the entire family, and changing it felt like erasing his mother's presence. The real shock came on a cold Tuesday morning in late November. Charles was reviewing correspondence when his private secretary knocked on the door with an urgent matter. Legal documents had been filed claiming that certain properties and assets from the Queen's estate should be redistributed to include provisions for Camilla's children and extended family. The papers argued that, as Queen Consort, Camilla had rights to influence the distribution of royal assets, and that her bloodline deserved recognition within the inheritance structure. Charles felt his blood run cold as he read through the legal jargon. This wasn't a simple request or a misunderstanding. Someone had gone to considerable effort and expense to challenge his mother's carefully crafted will. His hands trembled as he reached the section detailing which properties were being contested. Birkhall, the beloved Scottish residence where he and Camilla had spent countless happy hours. Several pieces from the royal art collection that his mother had intended for public display. Even jewelry that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, which had been explicitly left to Catherine for the future of the monarchy. He called for his legal team immediately. As they assembled in the study, Charles learned the full extent of what was happening. The claim suggested that significant portions of Balmoral estate should be set aside for a trust that would benefit Camilla's grandchildren. It proposed that certain crown properties be made available for use by her children from her first marriage. Most shocking of all, it argued that historically significant jewelry pieces should be available for Camilla to distribute as she saw fit among her female relatives. Charles dismissed his advisors and sat in silence for a long while. His mother had spent 70 years building and protecting the monarchy's legacy. She had been deliberate and fair in her planning, ensuring that tradition was honored while also showing care for every member of the family. This legal challenge felt like a betrayal not just of him, but of everything his mother had stood for. He needed to speak with Camilla directly. That evening, he asked her to join him in the sitting room after dinner. She arrived cheerfully, chatting about plans for an upcoming engagement. Charles waited until she was seated before placing the legal documents on the table. Between them, Camilla's face went pale as she recognized the papers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. Charles watched his wife carefully, searching her expression for answers. Was she surprised? Guilty? Defensive? Her reaction would tell him everything he needed to know. She reached for her teacup, but her hand shook slightly. Charles had known Camilla for decades. He understood her moods, her gestures, her ways of deflecting uncomfortable conversations. But right now, sitting across from her, with his mother's legacy hanging in the balance, he realized there were things about his wife he perhaps didn't know at all. The silence stretched between them like an ocean. Charles finally spoke, his voice quieter than he expected. He asked her simply if she knew about these legal documents, if she had been involved in filing them, if this was truly what she wanted after everything his family had been through. Camilla set down her cup and met his eyes. What she said next would determine not just their personal relationship, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. Charles waited, his heart heavy with the hope that there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that could make sense of this situation. But deep down, he feared he already knew the truth. The woman sitting across from him was no longer just his wife and companion. She was queen consort, with her own family interests and her own ideas about what she deserved. And those interests, it seemed, collided directly with the sacred duty Charles had to protect his mother's memory and the institution she had spent her lifetime serving. Camilla's response was not what Charles had hoped for. Instead of confusion or denial, she straightened her shoulders and spoke with a conviction that surprised him. She explained that her family deserved consideration too. After all, she had stood by Charles through decades of public scrutiny and private pain. Her children had endured harsh treatment from the press and public because of their relationship. Didn't that sacrifice warrant some recognition within the royal framework? Charles listened as his wife laid out her reasoning. She spoke of how Tom and Laura had always been respectful of the royal family, how they had stayed out of the spotlight despite the attention their mother received. She talked about her grandchildren growing up in the shadow of the monarchy without any of its benefits or security. The legal claim, she insisted, was simply about ensuring her family's future and acknowledging their connection to the crown. But as Camilla continued speaking, Charles heard something that chilled him. She mentioned that the queen had been old-fashioned in her thinking, that times had changed, and that modern royal families across Europe had evolved to include extended family networks. She suggested that his mother's will, while well-intentioned, didn't reflect the realities of their blended family situation. Perhaps, she offered carefully, some adjustments could be made that would honor the queen's memory while also being fair to everyone involved. Charles felt something break inside him. His mother had not been old-fashioned. She had been wise, thoughtful, and protective of an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years. The queen had actually been quite generous in her personal bequests to many people outside the immediate royal line. But the properties and items tied to the crown were not hers to distribute freely, nor were they Charles's, nor would they ever be Camilla's. They belonged to the nation and to history itself. He asked Camilla directly if she understood what she was really requesting. Did she comprehend that challenging the queen's will would create a public scandal? That it would damage the monarchy's reputation at a time when they needed stability? That it would hurt William, Catherine, and his grandchildren, who were the future of everything his mother had worked to preserve? Camilla's face hardened. She countered that William and Catherine already had everything. They had multiple residences, unlimited resources, public adoration, and the certainty that their children would one day rule. What did her children have? What legacy would her grandchildren inherit? She had given up her own family's privacy and peace to become queen consort. Surely that deserved more than just a title and ceremonial duties. The argument that followed was unlike anything they had experienced in their long relationship. Charles found himself defending his mother's decisions, explaining the constitutional implications of what Camilla was suggesting, and trying to make her understand that this wasn't about fairness between families. This was about protecting something far larger than any individual's desires or grievances. But Camilla seemed to have made up her mind. She revealed that she had consulted with lawyers months ago. Shortly after the contents of the queen's will had been fully disclosed to the family, she had felt hurt and excluded by certain decisions. When she expressed her concerns to her children, they had encouraged her to seek legal advice. The lawyers had assured her that there were grounds to contest certain aspects of the estate distribution, particularly regarding properties that Charles had enjoyed during his time as Prince of Wales. Charles realized with growing horror that this had been planned carefully and deliberately. This wasn't an impulsive reaction or a misunderstanding. His wife had been strategizing for months about how to claim pieces of his mother's legacy for her own family. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. Over the following days, Charles met with his advisors, lawyers, and trusted members of the family. William was furious when he learned what was happening. Anne expressed her dismay in characteristically blunt terms. Even Edward, usually diplomatic and measured, stated firmly that their mother's wishes must be honored without exception. The family closed ranks in a way they hadn't since the difficult years following Diana's death. Legal experts explained to Charles that while Camilla's claim would likely be unsuccessful in court, the process would be messy in public. Every detail of the Queen's estate would be scrutinized in the media. Family tensions would be exposed and analyzed. The monarchy would appear fractured and vulnerable at a time when Republican sentiment was growing in several Commonwealth nations. The damage could be substantial and lasting. Charles attempted several more conversations with Camilla, hoping to find a resolution that wouldn't tear their family apart. He offered compromises. Perhaps certain personal items of sentimental value could be shared more broadly. Maybe provisions could be made from his own private resources to create a trust for her grandchildren. But Camilla remained firm. She wanted recognition within the Queen's estate distribution itself. She wanted it documented officially that her family had rights and claims to the royal heritage. During one particularly difficult exchange, Camilla said something that Charles would never forget. She stated that she had sacrificed her own children's emotional well-being so that Charles could pursue his destiny. She had accepted being called terrible names in the press, had endured death threats, and had lived under constant scrutiny. In return, she believed she had earned the right to secure her family's position within the royal structure. If the Queen had truly valued Camilla's role, she argued, the will would have reflected that value more substantially. Charles tried to explain once more that his mother had valued Camilla. The Queen had eventually accepted their marriage, had included Camilla in family events, and had even granted her the title of Queen Consort rather than Princess Consort, which had been the original plan. But there was a difference between personal acceptance and institutional inheritance. The Crown's assets were not rewards for service or compensation for difficulties endured. They were held in trust for the nation and for future generations. The impasse seemed insurmountable. Camilla would not withdraw her legal claim. Charles could not allow his mother's will to be contested without response. His lawyers informed him that there were really only two paths forward. Either he could negotiate some form of settlement with Camilla, which would set a dangerous precedent and essentially validate her claims, or he could fight the legal challenge and allow the courts to decide, which would expose the family to public scrutiny and potential scandal. But there was a third option that no one had yet spoken aloud. Charles thought about it during long, sleepless nights. He considered it while walking the grounds of Windsor Castle where his mother had spent so many years. He weighed it against his duty to the Crown, his responsibility to his children and grandchildren, and yes, his feelings for the woman he had loved for so long. The third option was the most painful, but perhaps the only one that would truly protect the monarchy and honor his mother's legacy. Charles would have to make a choice between his wife and the Crown. It was a choice he had hoped never to face again, having already lived through the agony of that decision decades earlier. But here he was, once more standing at a crossroads where love and duty pulled him in opposite directions. As Christmas approached, the tension in the royal household was palpable. Staff members spoke in hushed tones. Family members made careful arrangements to avoid crossing paths unnecessarily. And Charles, King of the United Kingdom and defender of the faith, sat alone in his study night after night, staring at his mother's photograph and asking her forgiveness for what he was about to do. The decision crystallized in Charles's mind during a particularly difficult meeting with his constitutional advisors. They had laid out the stark reality before him. If Camilla's legal challenge proceeded, it would expose the monarchy to questions about financial transparency, privilege, and the very nature of hereditary wealth. Opposition parties would seize the opportunity to call for investigations into royal finances. Republican movements would use the family dispute as evidence that the monarchy was outdated and concerned only with preserving wealth rather than serving the nation. More concerning still was the international dimension. Charles was not just king of the United Kingdom. He was head of state for 14 other Commonwealth realms. Several of these nations were already contemplating becoming republics. Jamaica had been particularly vocal about this possibility. Australia had renewed discussions about constitutional change. A messy family legal battle over the previous queens. A state could provide exactly the ammunition these Republican movements needed to push their agendas. Forward, his private secretary, had been blunt in a way that few people dared. To be with the king, the monarchy's survival depended on public perception of its dignity, stability, and selfless service to the nation. A queen consort fighting for personal family enrichment from the beloved late queen's estate was the opposite of that image. It didn't matter what legal rights might exist or what grievances might be legitimate. The optics were devastating. Charles knew what had to be done, but knowing and acting were two different things. He loved Camilla. They had weathered so many storms together. She had been his confidant, his supporter, and his companion through decades of both joy and sorrow. The thought of life without her felt impossibly lonely. He was 75 years old, and the idea of beginning this final chapter of his life alone seemed almost unbearable. But then he would think of his mother. He remembered her sitting at her desk year after year, decade after decade, putting duty before everything else. She had sacrificed personal happiness, had endured criticism and challenges, and maintained her dignity through scandals and tragedies. She had never wavered in her commitment to something larger than herself. Could he do any less? William had been surprisingly gentle in their private conversations about the situation. His son understood the pain Charles was facing. William had his own memories of watching his father choose between love and duty, though the circumstances had been different then. Now, as a father and future king himself, William understood the weight of these decisions in a way he couldn't have comprehended as a young man. During one conversation in William's private quarters at Kensington Palace, father and son spoke with unusual openness. William acknowledged that Camilla had made Charles happy. She had brought stability to his father's personal life when it had been chaotic and painful. But William also spoke of responsibility to George, Charlotte, and Louis. What kind of monarchy would they inherit if its assets could be redistributed based on personal relationships rather than constitutional principles? What precedent would be set for future generations? Anne had been less diplomatic in her assessment. She told Charles plainly that their mother would be appalled by Camilla's actions. The Queen had overcome her initial reservations about Charles and Camilla's relationship. She had eventually welcomed Camilla into the family and given her blessing to the marriage. But this legal challenge was a betrayal of that trust and acceptance. Anne believed Charles had only one choice if he truly wanted to honor their mother's memory. The holidays that year were somber. Charles and Camilla maintained public appearances together, smiling for cameras and attending Christmas services at Sandringham. But behind closed doors, they barely spoke. Camilla had moved into a separate wing of the residence, and staff members reported that she spent hours on the phone with her children and lawyers. Strategizing their next moves, Charles used the quiet days after Christmas to finalize his plans. He consulted with the Lord Chamberlain, his legal team, and senior members of the royal household. They worked out details in absolute secrecy, knowing that any leak could complicate an already impossible situation. Messages were drafted and redrafted. Arrangements were made for Camilla's departure and future security. Legal documents were prepared that would make the separation official and binding. The confrontation came on a gray January morning. Charles requested Camilla's presence in the same sitting room where they had first discussed the legal claims months earlier. This time, there was no tea service laid out, no fire burning cheerfully in the hearth. The room felt cold and formal. Charles spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. He told Camilla that he had made his decision. The legal challenge to his mother's estate had to be withdrawn immediately and completely. There could be no negotiations, No compromises, and no public discussion of the matter. The Queen's will would stand exactly as she had written it. Without alteration or challenge, Camilla started to respond, likely to reiterate her position and justifications, but Charles raised his hand to stop her. He continued, explaining that if she was not willing to withdraw the legal claim within 48 hours, he would have no choice but to formally separate from her. She would retain her title as Queen Consort in name only. She would no longer reside in any royal residences. She would not participate in any official duties or events. For all practical purposes, she would cease to be his wife in anything but the legal sense. The color drained from Camilla's face. She had not expected this ultimatum. Perhaps she had believed that Charles loved her too much to ever take such drastic action. Perhaps she had assumed that his desire to avoid scandal would make him more willing to compromise. Whatever calculations she had made, she was now confronting the reality that she had miscalculated badly. She argued that he was being cruel and unreasonable. She insisted that her requests had been modest and justified. She accused him of valuing dead institutions more than living relationships. Her voice rose as she spoke, something Charles had rarely heard in all their years together. She was hurt, angry, and desperate, but Charles remained calm. He explained that this was not about cruelty or choosing between her and the crown. This was about protecting something that belonged to the entire nation and to future generations. His mother had understood that. His son understood that. One day his grandson would need to understand it too. If he allowed Camilla's challenge to proceed, he would be failing in his most fundamental duty as king. Camilla tried a different approach. She became softer, reminding him of their history together. She spoke of the years they had waited to be together, the obstacles they had overcome, the love they had built. She asked him how he could throw all of that away over property and possessions. Couldn't they find a middle ground? Couldn't they at least discuss alternatives? Charles felt his resolve waver for a moment. The woman before him was someone he had cared for deeply for most of his adult life. But then he glanced at the portrait of his mother that hung on the wall. Queen Elizabeth in her coronation regalia, looking serene and steadfast. He thought of the promise he had made to her, both explicitly and implicitly. To protect the monarchy she had served so faithfully, he told Camilla that he had already considered every possible alternative. His lawyers had explored every option. There was no middle ground that didn't compromise the integrity of his mother's wishes or set a dangerous precedent for the future. The choice was stark and simple. She could withdraw the legal claim and remain his wife in full partnership, or she could proceed with the challenge and face the consequences he had outlined. Camilla asked for time to think, to consult with her family and advisors. Charles agreed to give her 48 hours, though he suspected that more time would only make the situation more difficult. She left the room without another word, and Charles heard her footsteps echoing down the corridor, growing fainter until silence filled the castle once more. Those 48 hours felt like an eternity. Charles tried to maintain his normal schedule, attending meetings and reviewing papers, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself wandering through the castle rooms his mother had loved, seeking some sense of her presence, some confirmation that he was doing the right thing. The portraits of his ancestors looked down at him from the walls. Monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices and somehow found the strength to do what duty demanded. The 48 hours passed without word from Camilla. Charles had hoped, perhaps naively, that she would see reason and withdraw her claim. He had imagined a scenario where they could move forward together, the crisis averted, their relationship strained but intact. But as the deadline approached, and then passed with only silence from his wife's quarters, Charles understood that Camilla had made her choice. She chose to fight for what she believed her family deserved, even if it meant losing her position beside the king. In a strange way, Charles almost respected the conviction, even as it broke his heart. She was willing to sacrifice their relationship for her children and grandchildren. It was, in its own twisted way, a form of putting family duty above personal desire, though the family she chose was not the one Charles had hoped she would. Prioritize. The formal separation was announced on a Wednesday morning. The statement from Buckingham Palace was brief and carefully worded. It explained that Her Majesty the Queen Consort would be taking a step back from royal duties for personal reasons. She would retain her title, but would no longer reside at royal residences or participate in official engagements. The king thanked her for her years of service and wished her well. No mention was made of the legal dispute. Though astute observers would soon piece together the real story, the media response was immediate and intense. Speculation ran wild. Some outlets portrayed Charles as cold and vindictive, casting out his wife for unknown reasons. Others, better informed through strategic leaks, began reporting on the dispute over the Queen's estate. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with Charles, believing that the late Queen's wishes should be sacred. Others felt Camilla had been treated unfairly. Noting that royal spouses had always influenced family wealth distribution, William released his own statement. Brief but pointed, expressing his full support for his father's decision and his commitment to honoring the late Queen's legacy. Catherine appeared at a public engagement wearing a piece of jewelry that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. A quiet but powerful statement of solidarity, and ever practical, simply continued with her duties. Though those close to her reported that she had cut off all contact with Camilla entirely, the most painful moment came when Camilla actually departed from Windsor Castle. Charles watched from a window as her car pulled away, carrying her to a property owned by her children where she would now reside. He had not seen her in person since their final conversation. She had communicated only through lawyers and staff members. Maintaining her legal claim, even as she packed her belongings and prepared to leave, Charles felt a profound loneliness settle over him in the days that followed. The castle felt too large, too empty, too full of memories both recent and distant. He threw himself into his work with an intensity that concerned his staff. He took on more engagements, worked longer hours, and seemed determined to prove that he could fulfill his duties regardless of personal circumstances. But late at night, alone in his study, the facade would crack. He would think about all the years he and Camilla had waited to be together. The secret meetings, the phone calls, the letters, the hopes and dreams they had shared. All of it had led to this moment of separation, brought about not by external forces but by choices they had made about what mattered most. The legal battle continued. Though without Camilla's presence at royal events, it lost much of its sting. Her lawyers proceeded with the claim, but judges were clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The law was technically on the side of the late Queen's will, but the emotional dimensions of the case made headlines around the world. A queen consort fighting for her children's inheritance rights. Against her husband, the king became a tabloid sensation. Through it all, Charles maintained his dignity. He never spoke publicly about Camilla or their separation. He never criticized her choices or defended his own actions beyond the initial statement. He simply continued to serve, to represent the crown, to honor his mother's memory through his dedication to duty. William proved to be an unexpected source of strength during this period. Father and son grew closer than they had been in years. They discussed the challenges of leadership, the weight of responsibility, the personal sacrifices required by their positions. William shared his own struggles with balancing family and duty. And Charles found comfort in knowing that his son understood the impossible choices that came with their roles. Months passed, and the initial media frenzy began to fade. The legal case wound through the courts slowly, as such cases do. Legal experts predicted that Camilla's claim would ultimately be rejected, but the process would take years to fully resolve. In the meantime, life continued. Charles found new routines and rhythms. He spent more time with his grandchildren, finding joy in their innocence and energy. He deepened his involvement with his charitable work, particularly his environmental initiatives that had been his passion for decades. He discovered that life could continue, even after such a profound loss. Though it would never be quite the same as it had been, there were moments when he wondered if he had made the right choice. Late at night, or during quiet afternoons, when memories would surface unbidden, he would question whether protecting his mother's legacy had been worth the personal cost. But then he would remember her face, her voice, her unwavering commitment to duty over decades of service. He would think of his grandchildren and the monarchy they would inherit. And he would know, despite the pain, that he had made the only choice he could live with. The most unexpected development came from the public. After the initial shock and speculation, a strange thing happened. Charles's approval ratings began to rise. People appreciated his willingness to put principle above personal happiness. They respected his defense of his mother's wishes. Even those who disagreed with the monarchy as an institution found themselves admiring his commitment to duty. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace. People wrote about their own difficult family situations, about times they had to choose between love and responsibility, about the pain of doing what was right when it cost them dearly. Charles read many of these letters personally, finding odd comfort in knowing that his struggle was not unique, that others had faced similar crossroads and survived. A year after the separation, Charles attended a memorial service for his mother at Westminster Abbey. The cathedral was filled with dignitaries, family members, and representatives from around the world. As he processed down the aisle in his ceremonial robes, he felt the weight of history and duty pressing down upon him. But he also felt something else: peace. He had kept his promise to his mother. He had protected the institution she had dedicated her life to serving. He had shown his son and grandchildren that the crown was not a source of personal wealth or family advantage, but a sacred trust held on behalf of the nation. The cost had been high, perhaps the highest he could imagine paying. But as he knelt before the altar and prayed for his mother's soul, he knew she would have understood. More than that, he believed she would have been proud. The Archbishop's words during the service spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the courage to make difficult choices. Charles listened and felt tears on his cheeks, the first he had allowed himself to shed publicly since his mother's death. They were tears of grief, yes, for all that he had lost, but they were also tears of relief, of resolution, and of quiet pride that when tested, he had chosen to be the king his mother had raised him to be. Outside the Abbey, life in London continued as it always did. People went about their business, tourists took photographs, and the gray English sky threatened rain. Inside, a king mourned his mother and the life he might have had, while accepting the life he had chosen instead. It was not the ending anyone would have written for this story, but it was, Charles reflected, perhaps the most honest ending possible. Because in the end, being a monarch was not about happy endings or personal fulfillment. It was about service, sacrifice, and the willingness to put something larger than oneself above all else, no matter the cost.